a story to be told that goes back into deep antiquity in China and brings us to Western modernity, but it's a coming full circle of these narratives in a really beautiful way of bringing together voices from the deep past and from the present that have an innate capacity to inform what's happening in the world today in a unified voice or in a more holistic fashion.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Geological, the podcast that curates East Asian medicine and methods through the power of conversation. We are profoundly social creatures. It leads us to be compassionate, helpful, loving, and understanding. It drives us to be tribal, one-sidedly blind, and murderous. We will do almost anything in our search for connection. Love and hate, they're not opposites. They are both potent ways to stir up the chemical, hormonal, and neurological soup of belonging. On the mild end, there is the college fraternity hazing. On the horrific side are the atrocities that unfold in any war or conflict that you care to aim your attention towards. There are the small kindnesses that you do for another person in daily life. The held door or subway seat offered to someone who's older or pregnant because we understand what it is to be human. Witness the outpourings of assistance in the wake of a disaster or the aftermath of great storms and earthquakes. We are unavoidably social. We are wired to belong. Health and well-being requires that we belong to some kind of community. There's plenty of research that shows the detrimental effects of loneliness. Think of all the things you've done, perhaps not so good for yourself, in service of feeling connected or together with others. Maybe it's a bug in our wiring. The same thing that draws some of us together is what pushes others apart. The beliefs that make us create a not us of them. There's no belonging without drawing the lines of not belonging. I don't like looking in the mirror of who it is that I'm drawn to oppose. I like to think I'm capable, even welcome, the opportunity to include others that are different from me. I like to lean a little more on compassion for them and a little more accountability for us. But there are limits. I know I have mine, and I suspect that you have yours as well. At some point, you need to decide what you stand for and what you stand against. We are wired for connection, and we have our reasons, most of which we were never reasoned into in the first place. This makes it oh so difficult to change our minds because what's first required is a change of heart. Connection. Positive shared experiences. They go a long way in helping to navigate the turbulent waters of difference, identity, and belonging. Common ground, something shared and connective, that is the magic that helps to create a sense of shared community. And from shared community, we might even find respect for differences. Tea, for thousands of years, has been a kind of envoy that has allowed us human critters to pause together in appreciation, exploration, and conversation. Unlike the distilled or fermented spirits that are often used to create a feeling of connection, but come with the problem of clouded consciousness, tea, it calms the mind, clarifies the shen, and invites a pause that connects with the inner sensing that is the experience of ingesting tea. Brian Kirbis, the guest in this conversation, goes so far as to say that tea has been important to human social and cultural development and the evolution of consciousness. Camellia sinensis. It's a substance and spirit that we've been co-evolving with for quite a while now. We're going to get into this in just a moment, but first, a word from the people who make it possible for you to enjoy Geological on your commute. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. It's Women's Health Month at Mayway Herbs. Check out their new website for learning resources on helping women with herbal medicine. Are you a creature of habit? How about making a change that helps your patients and the planet with AccuFast needles? And later in the show, raising your fees doesn't have to be a difficult process. Jane has helpful suggestions on making it easy and effective. And finally, have you considered that having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things that you can do? Julie Bear Don't Walk has, and she can help you do something about it too. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lau, president of Mayway Herbs. May is Women's Health Month, and as a women-owned and women-run business, we especially love how Chinese medicine can support wellness through every stage of a woman's life. So in this month's newsletter and podcast, we're covering topics like PMS, pregnancy, menopause, and osteoporosis. We'll share expert insights and effective treatment strategies you can put to good use in your clinic. Our Plumflower brand line includes herbal tea pills, tablets, extract granules, and organic herbs, all of which you can find on Mayway.com. And where you can also find articles, videos, and other resources to support your practice. Since 1969, Mayway has been a trusted source for high-quality herbal products. In these challenging times, please know that we remain committed to keeping our products accessible and affordable so you can take care of yourself and your patients. As always, thank you for supporting Real Chinese Medicine.
Daily habits and routines feel comforting, familiar, easy, automatic. That's the power of repetition. You've worked out the kinks and can do it with your eyes closed. But what if you shook things up? What if you ditched the old routine and tried something new? Hi, I'm John Sten. I've practiced acupuncture for over 30 years, and together with my wife Kelly, we created the world's first eco-friendly acupuncture needle. The AccuFast earth-friendly needle system cuts your packaging waste by 60 to 90%, depending upon your needle type, speeds up your needling, gives you more control, and best of all, while you're healing patients, we plant a tree for every 2 boxes your clinic uses. Thousands of acupuncturists have already made the switch. In just the last year, they've helped plant over 16,000 trees. Since we started, that number has grown to over 50,000. So break the routine. Be the change. Visit AccuFastNeedles.com. Your patients and the planet will thank you.
Brian Kirbis, welcome to Qiological.
Nice to see you, Michael.
Nice to be here with you. So, today, tea. We're going to talk some tea.
And we're going to go deep with tea, perhaps. Talking about pu'er tea, or like deep in primary forests of Yunnan.
Deep into the pu'er forests. Yes, we're going to spill some tea, as my kid likes to say. All right. So, before we get into tea, look, I'm sure that you weren't always involved with tea. There's a path that has brought you to what you're doing. You know, as you look back and you see the various dots or stepping stones that have taken you to where you are, where would you say this began? Is there a moment, an inflection point, a pivotal moment in time? How did this all begin?
Well, the actual event was as an undergraduate student of anthropology at UC Santa Cruz, and I was given an opportunity to do field work. And I wrote up an independent study. I just recently found out about pu'er tea at the time. That was in early 2006. And my focuses were in environmental and medical anthropology. I was interested in the intersection of nature and culture, essentially looking at ecological health and human health and plant-human relationships. And pu'er tea was just starting to come into a certain ascendancy, a cultural revival, as it were, in Southwest China. I had some fluency in Chinese, interests in the region, and had an opportunity to go and take a look at what was happening in the tea mountains of Southwest China at that time, which was really incredibly fascinating. So that was the actual occasion of my being given access to the capacity of tea, what tea had to offer. And eventually I found that it was also a response to a lot of questions I'd been asking throughout my life from a very early age. So there's certainly a lot of personal myth and story and experience that all led up to that.
Yeah, there's always a lot that comes in. What were some of those questions?
Well, to go back to the very beginning, I was born on a Marine base upon my father's return from Vietnam. And so in a very real sense, I was born in this interstitial or this liminal space between the United States and Southeast Asia, and born into the middle of what I think of as our own Western cultural revolution. This is right in the middle of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. We were very much going through what I refer to as a small c, small r cultural revolution here in the United States. And so being born into that space, I went from there's Southern California, free love, free drugs, bohemian lifestyle upon my father's return. And in my early childhood, 4, 5, 6 years old, and was whisked off to my Mennonite grandparents' dairy farm in Western New York, and ended up being raised by my grandparents on a subsistence family farm, going to a Baptist church.
Wow.
I had this experience from a very, very young age of pure, unrestrained creative energy, and then a highly disciplinary, controlled, fundamentalist agricultural upbringing. And this was also an intergenerational space. It was an East-West conversation with respect to East Coast, West Coast United States, but also in a broader sense, as I would start to unpack this story and my own intergenerational story between Eastern and Western hemispheres. And so I was, from a very early age, occupying this center space and asking a lot of questions about this idea of duality or dialectics between self and other, East and West, tradition and modernity. And these were all the questions that would eventually come to bear on my work with tea.
Wow. I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing more of how that happens. It sounds like you have a bit of comfort with that liminal in-between space as well.
Maybe. If I have a certain fluency, it's a practiced fluency. I don't know if it's ever possible to be comfortable in this space or not.
No, I you know what? I agree with you. But a practiced fluency, that's worth aiming at.
I think so. Yeah, it's all we can do. You know, one of my big influences is Carl Jung, and at one point he says, by refusing to choose sides, we become what happens in the middle, and thereby take the conflict on ourselves. And so when we are occupying this middle space, this liminal space between conscious and unconscious, or between East and West, especially in the contemporary geopolitical climate, we're trying to preserve a space that honors distinct worldviews and bring them into dialogue. It requires a significant degree of nuance and consideration to find the right way to express in that space and to honor both sides. And Yeah, you're carrying the pain, you're taking the controversy on, but you've been equipped, hopefully, with the tools over time as you come into maturity to occupy that space.
It's a kind of cultivation. And it seems to me that the liminal space, I mean, as you were pointing out, can you ever be that comfortable in it? I mean, even though I think we've all made journeys into it, by the time you live a few decades, hopefully you've experienced some liminality in your life, or you probably haven't matured very much. I find for myself, every time I come up to that space, it's kind of like, oh, I wonder what it's going to be. Because it's always a little bit beyond whatever I've got, and it's never like the last time you were there. It's always asking something new of you.
Yeah, and keeping in mind that this is a very much a Chinese medicine forward podcast, and bringing that to bear, there is this interiority of whether it's the unconscious or the interior of the body, and the requirement that a practitioner be engaged in their own cultivation and healing journey in order to be able to bring that to the surface and apply that towards their work in the world. So it's very much deep ecology. I think in Chinese medicine or in tea practice, I very much frame it as spiritual ecology, as deep ecology, and love this microcosm, macrocosm metaphor, the motif that we apply in our work.
Spiritual ecology and tea. Tell me more about that.
Well, the Chinese myth has it that a revered personage named Shennong discovered tea in 2737 BC, and a lot of folks know the story of Shennong, but it doesn't seem to have been unpacked yet anywhere in the literature. It's preserved as a myth without having really been explored. And my work occurs at the intersection not only of these other dialectics that I mentioned, but also of oral and text-based narrative and storytelling. And so what is the story of Shennong? Who was Shennong? And typically he's referred to as the divine husbandman or the divine farmer. And as I have such a love for language, but also applying that love for language to a more nuanced storytelling style, I like to think of Shennong not as the divine husbandman or farmer. I feel that language has some inherent problematic aspects, or it's not a translation that is as easily received and in conversation with the present. And so I've chosen to champion Shennong, Shen being spirit, of course, Nong as agriculture or farmer, as the spirit cultivator or the spiritual cultivator, and by extension, the spiritual ecologist, because this personage, this mythical figure, is imbued with this interior gaze, this tacit inner awareness that is brought to bear on the flourishing of this early agrarian utopianism that he's described as developing in antiquity. And so that's the Chinese side of it, of spiritual ecology. The contemporary side is that there's an increasing community of practitioners who are all falling under the aegis of a discipline or a movement called spiritual ecology. And we have people like the transcendentalists, or in more contemporary times, Thomas Berry or Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, the contemporary Sufi mystic, and Vandana Shiva in the Indian context. People who are endorsing or insisting upon re-enchanting the world, bringing spirit or the ethereal or the divine back into conversation with the material.
Re-enchanting the world.
Ultimately, I think of the Shennong myth as bookending and ancestral to the contemporary movement and voices in spiritual ecology. And it allows for a story to be told that goes back into deep antiquity in China and brings us to Western modernity, but it's a coming full circle of these narratives in a really beautiful way of bringing together voices from the deep past and from the present that have an innate capacity to inform what's happening in the world today in a unified voice or in a more holistic fashion.
Mm-hmm. So, I tend to be a nuts and bolts practitioner. And I love mythological images, always have. I too really enjoyed reading Jung's work when I was younger. Very enticing for me. But I have found over the years, I've had trouble embodying any kind of those images. It's like they're like figments of a dream. They're wisps of a dream. They're bits and pieces that they show up like the fragrance of lilies on a summer night, right? And then they're gone again. And when it comes to things like the story of Shennong, you had the inner gaze, you had this like outer perception as well, tasting different things. What did they do to me internally? How's that brought forward in I'm going to say more tangible way in our modern moment? Again, I love the images, but I'm always looking for something kind of practical I can fill my teacup with, so to speak.
Sure. And yeah, I agree, Michael. I think that these myths and stories do not stand the test of time if they do not have practical application in our lives. And there's very much what I call a pedagogy of the tea table, or also the praxis of tea. It's the drinking of the tea itself that's going to provide the nutritional efficacy or the ability to connect to qi and to connect to these stories. It's the materiality of the tea and the practices that surround it. And in my work, I refer to that as garden to Gaiwan. Gaiwan being a Chinese tea brewing vessel. And what garden to Gaiwan for me is an agroforestry farm to table ethos of tea. And it consists of 5 parts. And these are the domains of tea that I work in a tangible sense. The first being original ecology, tea agroforestry, which is the farming part of it, which is the cultivator part of it, externally in the forests, but it also has this internal dimension in the body. So it goes from original ecology to craft, which is artisanal craftsmanship, to storage, to understanding that pu'er tea, which we haven't really gotten into yet, is defined by transformation. It's a living tea. It contains the microbiome of its forest of origin, and it's undergoing an active state change.
I know it's the coolest thing about it. That stuff is constantly evolving.
It's constantly evolving.
Fermenting, cooking.
And it's happening within the physicality, the materiality of these cakes and bricks of tea, but it's also happening as a cultural ferment in the world. And the story of tea, as the story of spiritual ecology, going from Shennong to the present, again, is this mythical ferment, or is a cultural ferment contained within the story, and there's practice inside of that story. So we've made it to the third, which is storage. The fourth is brewing. How do we brew these teas? And I gave a talk recently to the Lilium Initiative on the correspondences between tea practice and tea craft and brewing, and that of medicinal substances, this practice of powder or preparation of medicinal substances in Chinese medicine. And so there's something that's very practical that brings tea into conversation with Chinese herbal practice, which again is innate within this myth of Shennong, who not only discovered tea, but wrote the first Materia Medica, or Shennong Buncao. So there's another important conversation happening there. And then finally, the fifth stage is appreciation. How do we drink tea? And what's the value of tea? How do we talk about it? How do we use our senses? And how do we feel into our bodies? And what is that active practice of cultivation through tea practice? So it's happening as internal cultivation, as cha dao, within the body, but it's also happening as external practice, as cha li, as the ritual or the social etiquette of tea. This greater work of tea, not within individual bodies, but in collective bodies.
Yeah, there for sure is the cha li, the sort of ceremony around it, the ritual around it. There's that aspect. You can look at like the Japanese. I mean, they've taken it to an extreme degree there. I've also experienced it in Taiwan in a more, I'm not going to say casual. Casual is not the right word. Less, all right, this is a bit of a judgment, but I'm going to say it anyway, in a less encumbered way. I mean, there's definitely ways I've hung out with people in Taiwan. They have a way that they interact with their tea. It's not particularly ritualized, although they've got certain steps they do or things that they like. The thing that I noticed in Taiwan drinking tea, it seemed like the emphasis was on the connection of the people around the drinking of the tea. There's very much a sense of people coming together and being with each other in a social way that I found absolutely extraordinary.
I couldn't agree with you more. And truthfully, during my time apprenticing with an artisanal tea producer in Yunnan, which lasted for a decade, I didn't have access to any of this Taoist stuff or any of this Chan or Buddhist stuff. I did have access peripherally, but my mentor in artisanal tea was very much into the social expression of tea. There was very much in the world, and tea as a vehicle for self and family and society. And that's really what I had, was this external expression of tea, this more convivial sharing of tea. And just to bookend that with another incident from my life. When I was younger, I spent close to a decade with a Chinese internal practitioner. This is something I had mentioned previously to you, and he's somebody who just prefers to be left anonymous, but he's an internalist who was a meditator and a martial artist and a medical practitioner. And so I was given very, very strong foundations in Chinese internal arts. And then I went to China, and this was my second mentor, my second teacher in this lifetime, who was very much an externalist. And that was necessary for me, is to understand how to express my own inner cultivation and relationship to self in the world. And so that was another dialectic that was presented to me and that I'm constantly contending with, is this relationship between the interiority and the exteriority of practice, which again is just another false dichotomy, and it brings us back to the center. So,
well, you could call it a false dichotomy. You could also look at it as, this is very yin-yang, what you're talking about. In yin-yang, it sounds so simple, but, oh man, I find it endlessly confusing and simple at the same time. But it occurred to me the other day that part of the way that yin-yang work, right, it's like there's a unity that's a duality, and the way that it works is by the two ends of the spectrum working against each other. And that's actually what makes it work, that it's working against each other.
And that wholeness, this is really interesting. This brings up the idea of Ganying, of resonance in Chinese medicine. And there's some real amazing literature on this topic and work being done on this subject. But Zhang Zai's Philosophy of Qi, this remarkable book that's circulating out there right now, the author is describing how this experience of Gan isn't of like and like. It's of dissimilar things coming together in order to work towards an expression of the Tao. So I think what you're describing is absolutely right. That it's that coming together of these, what I describe as a dichotomous relationship, these opposites of yin and yang. It can't be yin and yin that make up the Tao. It becomes one-sided and it becomes pure subjectivity. We need an intersubjective construct of sorts, or we need this type of relationality between opposites in order to...
Yes, relationality between opposites, which it's tricky because look, opposites, generally speaking, they would like to destroy each other.
But we also say that opposites attract, right? So there's this simultaneous attraction and repulsion, or kind of resistance in there.
Resistance, yes.
Right. Yeah. And it's what Dewey Ming is describing, I think, when he says that the West is fond of dialectics, whereas the East is fond of dialogue. And it's like subtle distinctions between two sides coming into conversation, one asserting the primacy of its own view, absorbing the other, and ascending to the next level of that particular dialectic, or being in dialogue and finding a certain mutuality. I don't know if this is agreeing to disagree, or accommodation, or a recognition that innate within each of those worldviews or perspectives, there's something that's shared that can serve as the basis for mutuality. There's some sort of similitude, for it. So, I mean, again, going back to this idea of tangibles, something like biodiversity loss and climate change, these very real ecological concerns that don't play nicely within national borders, that are global or planetary concerns.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that honestly just makes running a practice easier. Let's dive into something that's never easy, but sometimes necessary: raising your fees. It can feel awkward, right? But here's a tip that can really help. Consider offering flexibility to your patients as you introduce the change. When patients face new fees, it's natural for them to feel uncertain or concerned. That's where flexibility can really make a difference. Offering options like a phased increase, suggesting a payment plan, or even taking a moment to talk things through can help to ease the transition. These thoughtful gestures show your patients that you're listening and care about them, which strengthens the trust you've worked so hard to build. If you're looking for more ideas on how to navigate these kinds of changes, head to frontdesk.jane.app and check out the article, How to Tell Clients You're Raising Your Fees. One last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, you can use the code CHEOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. Yes, it really gets our attention to how the world is actually put together and where the boundaries and borders of things really are.
Very much so.
It's more like mountains and watersheds and, bioregions.
And so I think, too, contemporary literature that really inspires me, the work of people like James Miller at Duke, China's Green Religion, where he's really bringing contemporary kind of critical theory and thought and global concerns or planetary concerns to bear in considering the role of Taoism in the world today. And with respect to my own work, and I read broadly, I have very particular disciplinary interests within my region. However, it's incumbent upon me, in so much as I believe that tea aspires to universality, that we need to read broadly, and there's a lot that we need to cover. But with respect to tea, I do believe that it is a container that contains within it implicitly the history of consciousness of the East. And there's something that's practice-oriented. There's a stream of consciousness in which tea travels, or that is contained within the substance of the tea that we can gain access to. And animate.
Okay, that sounds really inviting, and I want to know more about that.
Well, part of what I've been trying to do over these last several years, and I began this work in 2006, and as I mentioned, my work has very specific disciplinary.
I know it's you took yourself out on a field trip. You made your own field trip.
This was my Heart of Darkness journey. Yeah, it was very much a field trip of sorts, but that makes it sound so prosaic, Michael. Yeah, it was, as we were alluding to prior to our conversation, this type of work requires an immense amount of effort and struggle and hardship to really get to the heart of the matter. So in some ways, it was very much a Heart of Darkness journey. It was a journey into the interiority of ancient primary forests along the border of China and Burma, now Myanmar, but it's also a journey into the interiority of my own heart in my own inner landscape. And it requires an enormous amount of effort, but in arriving in that space of interiority and turning around and facing the world again and re-emerging, how do we tell that story? And that's the story of tea for me, is of what for the indigenous peoples, and the specificity of that is the Hmong Khmer tea cultivators in this remote frontier of China and the uplands of Southeast Asia. So the Hmong Khmer are considered the original tea cultivators, and they honor tea. They have a tea ancestor. They believe that there's an animate spirit of tea that they refer to as albaila, and the Chinese refer to as the chahun, the tea. And again, another really interesting place to explore that, this idea of hun, right, which in Chinese medicine resides in the liver. And in the daytime, it circulates with the blood, and in the evening, it returns to the liver in dreams. And so this relationship between blood and qi, and this idea of the hun, this animate spirit that dwells in the organ that is the wood element, which is basically the forest. It dwells in the forest, so to speak. So I've been understanding tea as exactly that, as this animate force that circulates throughout the world in the daytime. In the evenings, it returns to the forest in dreams. It's an animate substance that gives us access to the unconscious, but then we can also bring that to bear in the world in a practice-oriented way. So learning how to honor the indigenous understanding of tea and the indigenous body, their own phenomenal experience of the body, their own way of languaging that, and transmitting that through their artisanal craft, their tea drinking practices, and how that travels out of these upland hill tribe villages, these indigenous villages, and down into the valleys, into urban tea houses, to the emperor as tribute tea historically, and then transgresses the boundaries of empires and nation states, treats them as porous, and manages to extend beyond any containers that try to contain it in order to proliferate throughout the world. And it couldn't do that strictly as a material substance. I really do believe that it's part of the animate agency of tea that allows that to happen. And when we can learn to frame that in an appropriate manner, then again, it allows us to understand the unfolding, the story, the myth, and how to make that somehow tangible through tea practice, but also to understand the discursive power of tea and the agency of tea in the world.
Well, this may sound very pedestrian on my part, but as I hear you describe how tea moves out of the mountain into the valleys, works its way into the cities and crosses borders, it sounds like a damn weed.
Oh, well, there's scientific literature out there about how caffeine in the pollens of plants encourages insect pollinators. So I think of tea as, it's this, what we call these days, or some people call these days, the more than human world. I look at the way in which tea has appropriated insect pollinators to participate in its flourishing. And I think of it in the sense of like flourishing in a Chinese medical sense, or in a yangsheng, cultivating life. And this animating force internally, this desire or this intention towards self-preservation and proliferation.
Yes. We were talking earlier before we rolled tape about younger practitioners. You've been talking to some younger practitioners and what a rough go they're having in getting started with a practice. And I was recalling back when I started, it was a rough go back then too, because I didn't know what I was doing. I was in the process of learning it. And I mean, there's a lot to learn when you don't know how to do certain things, and it takes some time. But one of the things that I think I have gotten from my experience of having a practice, more importantly, having a business, is that businesses, successful businesses, flourishing businesses, businesses that nourish the people that are in them, it works on the principle in nature of mutual exchange and benefit. And I was just hearing you talk about the tea and the pollinators and the tea and the people. And there's a kind of tea hun, right? There's a tea spirit. And all these things happen because there is some kind of exchange that results in benefit for both sides. So often I hear young practitioners talking about, well, it's hard, and, I don't want to take money from people. And it's like, well, nature doesn't work that way. Nature wants something, and it wants to give something. And it seems to me that both sides of that are really essential. And so this is just my thought on it. I'm curious to know from your side of the tea table, how does that make sense in terms of cha dao and in terms of how you see tea being this like interactive lubricant for human beings and their connections and experience?
It's an enormous question. It really is.
It's my job.
It's one that, as you ask it, it makes me really curious if this is a question that's being asked out there in the tea world, in the tea marketplace, in the academia that's taking place around tea. It's really poignant. But again, going back to my own inspirations or calling into this work of tea, this work towards reconciliation within myself as a healing substance for myself, but also for the planet, and looking at this central space that tea occupies as well between nature and culture, and the work that tea has the capacity to inform and inspire in human beings. I think that's so remarkable. And as I had said, I have to read broadly because tea is not, it doesn't conform to disciplinary distinctions. The emergent voice of tea, or this spirit of tea, it requires disciplining, which is really, really important. And a moment ago, you mentioned that need for young practitioners to go through the hardship, the struggle, and to come into a certain professional maturation. And this is perennial wisdom. This is the relationship between that connection to source, that kind of primal energy and that mythic storytelling inspires, and that inner sense of dynamism and connection to yuan qi, and a certain primal quality that exists within us in relation to the perennial wisdom of self-cultivation and I think the human project. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
It's a big question. It's a question I have. Like, how much suffering do you need to learn some lessons that you need to learn to like wash away bad ideas that at least that I've acquired as a younger person, all right? Sometimes there's some suffering and hardship that help me burn away my illusions of how things work.
Yeah, for you can reflect on that from your own positionality. You can think about yourself as a younger practitioner and who and where you are now, the way in which you've managed to answer that for yourself. And each of us can do that, but at the same time, we look out into the world and we see the immense amount of suffering happening out in the world. And in some of the Zen literature and within the tea community, there is this idea of peace being achieved through a cup of tea. And there's the imminence of simply participating with tea as an individual, but again, this collective notion of participating with tea. And I think of it ecologically, and tea as an ecological indicator. So it has specific requirements with respect to soil and climate and biodiversity. And so we look at tea as this interstitial plant between heaven and earth. We think of this notion of Tian, of heaven, earth, and human in Chinese philosophy. And again, thinking of biodiversity and ecological concerns, but also climate concerns. And tea resides in the middle, and it's really working towards equanimity and to restoring balance. And perhaps that's a...
Balance is such a, I almost want to say it's a red herring. Why do I say this? It's, I hear about it all the time, like, oh, things are out of balance or out of harmony. We need to bring balance. My experience with when I've thought about what balance was for much of my life, I conflated balance with a static, unchanging state. It's all fine, and it's harmonious, and it's good. Well, you can certainly find those moments. You definitely can find them in a cup of tea, hanging around with some friends, because I think it really opens up people's hearts and their minds. First of all, to sit in community with each other, and secondly, there is something about tea that's a bit psychoactive. It really softens the spirit a bit, at least it does for me, and I've watched it happen with other people. But this idea of balance, I'd like to get your sense of it, because it seems to me that balance, well, I used to think of it as being something static. It's actually tremendously dynamic.
Well, and we brought this up. I used the word, and then you have called me out on my choice of words in a way, but just more of a curiosity around what is balance. Coming out of this question of suffering and how long can we suffer, and whether or not it's possible, and in what capacity we can alleviate suffering in the world. But we can no more alleviate all the suffering in the world as we can all just become mutually enlightened or collectively enlightened. I think finding that what we're talking about is balance. Generally, and I agree with you completely. I believe that balance does come across as somewhat of a static concept. I generally refer to it as a dynamic equilibrium. Constantly, there's this constant attempt to preserve the center in light of constant change and transformation.
And sometimes that transformation is, it's mountains blowing up, it's earthquakes, it's social revolution, it's famines, it's all kinds of things.
Yeah, and what do we do with that, right? Yeah, I agree. Not to turn our conversation about tea into a political conversation, but just thinking about Taiwan, for instance, because you had brought it up. You're talking about how much you enjoyed sitting and drinking tea in Taiwan, right?
Oh my God, it's some of the best evenings of my life.
And so, yeah, imagine if we had the two sides, if we had China and the U.S. sitting in Taiwan drinking tea together, right? And just having a good time over tea. Kind of restoring this free-spirited heart of humanity and just this sense of a social etiquette or a ritual etiquette. And if we look back to the literature historically in Burma, we actually find tea and the cost of tea and the cost of bringing in the tea practitioner appearing in court records and accounting. So tea was used as a formal form of conflict resolution, and it was a means of demonstrating that the two sides in drinking tea together are agreeing to the decision of the court. So tea historically has been used in conflict resolution, and you had brought up tea as a, I forget the word you used, as a psychoactive substance.
There is a psychoactive element to it, and not just the caffeine. People often think, the caffeine, and there's that. And it's there's some other stuff in tea besides caffeine.
Well, the reason I bring that back up, I think it's a wonderful choice of words, because that opens up something else that I'm really fascinated by, which is, what is that? How do people participate with tea? Tea is a force of nature. It's a very powerful substance. And particularly with pu'er tea, there are two main categories. There's sheng and there's shou. There's raw and there's cooked. And most people have really incredibly deep affective connection to the cooked pu'ers, to the teas that have gone through an extensive fermentation process, so as to present these deep, earthy flavor profiles. However, the sheng, or the raw pu'er, goes through a natural fermentation process. It's essentially pure, raw, vital energy. It's a force of nature, very, very literally.
Having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things you can do as a healthcare practitioner, because a robust business is the ultimate expression of vital qi, and that's the heart of our medicine. I'm Julie Bairdontlock, and I help practitioners grow nourishing, profitable, authentic businesses that embody the generative cycle of Chinese medicine. This isn't about all yang all the time. It's about expanding your own internal capacity, growing collaborative relationships with your patients for ethical patient retention, and marketing as an extension of this medicine, not a necessary evil. You already know that everything is connected in your patients' lives and bodies. The same is true for your business. When we align your systems, your schedule, your pricing, and your offerings with you, we create flow, which means more spaciousness, more impact, and more joy. When you are in the flow, fully resourced in terms of chi, time, and money, your business becomes a source of healing, not just for your patients, but for you. Let's grow something rooted, radiant, and real. Visit lifeflowconsulting.com to learn more.
Yeah. Oh, very, young green pu'er tea. I mean, you can drink it, but it's it's a little harsh. Green in the sense of like a little wild.
Absolutely. And I would challenge harsh, but right there with you on wild. And I would suggest, as I do to anybody, whenever this comes up, that it's not the tea that's harsh, it's our own lack of brewing technique and our lack of understanding of the innate nature of that substance and how to express it in such a manner as to impart healing efficacy, or even just, to express. So raw pu'er, 苦涩香甜, bitter, astringent, fragrant, sweet. Our responsibility as a brewer is the same as parents with an infant. That infant can't care for its own sense of balance, right? Dynamic equilibrium between its own suffering and its own bliss, which it contains. If somebody has never raised a child and they're holding somebody's baby and it's sleeping and it's comfortable and it opens its eyes and there's this beautiful spirit that radiates and it's blissfulness, but then something happens where this dynamic equilibrium of the infant, it goes into a state of being too full or too empty, too hot or cold, too wet or too dry. It's going to scream, it's going to cry, it's going to let you know. And people do with raw pu'er the same thing they do with infants. Sometimes is as fast as possible, hand it back to the parent. Here, you deal with this.
Here, this is yours. Yeah.
And with raw pu'er, people are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They don't know how to brew it, and they blame the tea rather than recognizing their own lack of technique and understanding of the nature of that substance. And so young pu'er is perfectly drinkable, assuming it conforms to these standards of healthy tea garden ecology, proper craftsmanship, healthy storage, brewing. Then the appreciation can present with that same luminous spirit as does that young infant. So this is our ability to understand the power of nature and, again, the nature of this dynamic equilibrium of preserving the central experience of consciousness.
So when I say that green pu'er is harsh, I don't mean that as a bad thing. I mean that as something about its essential nature. It's a little wild. It's unregulated. It's immature. It's not a value judgment, meaning bad. It's like, ooh, wow, that's something when you drink it. And again, that's part of that dynamic equilibrium. It's like, oh, like who is this tea at this moment in time? Oh, you're like that. Okay, got it. It's not a negative thing. It's a strong experience. It's powerful. Like you were saying, the capacity to have an appreciation for what something is. Oh, I think that begins to get at the crux of a whole lot of things with tea and other people for that matter. You know, some people are really hard to take in, but if we can find a way to appreciate them, like we appreciate a harsh green young pu'er, maybe there's another way to have a connection or relationship with them. Or not have a relationship. Like, thanks, that was interesting, but no.
Absolutely. And I struggle with this with myself as well. I think what you're describing is harsh. Again, it needs to be experienced within a proper sense of li or ritual or etiquette, right? It needs to be presented in such a way as to ensure that that harshness doesn't present as discord. So what you're actually speaking to when you're speaking of harshness is, in my mind, potency. And in choosing this word,
there is a potency.
And I think of, when I'm choosing this word, I think of the Huainanzi and the Chinese literature that speaks about moral potency and speaks about de or virtue and how we express our sense of potency or virtue in the world. And that allows us to extend this notion of harshness. When you say harshness, as you noticed in my response, I think back to coming back from college when I was 18 and using the word funky with one of my uncles, and him kind of like looking at me out of the corner of his eye being like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that good funky or bad funky?
That's right. What kind of funky is that funky?
Yeah, and there are directions we can go with that, Michael, and without going on a tangent. And just an example of that is with shocha. So shopu, these pile fermented, highly refined substances with these deep earthy profiles. So many people in the West have a very laissez-faire attitude about brewing these teas. And a lot of people say that it's very forgiving as a tea. And my mentor, who is very harsh, very potent, very consolidated chi, and like when he's in the room, you know he's in the room. There's assertiveness bordering on aggressiveness, and I guess that's where the potency doesn't want to present as harshness. We don't want, I like that. I think we don't want the assertiveness of the vital force of sheng to present as aggressiveness. And when we can back off of the aggressiveness or the harshness, just to learn how to appreciate the wildness of it, then that makes tea, nature as an ingestible substance. This is referring to James Miller's like wording of the Tao and Taoist practice, seeing nature as an ingestible substance or ingestible power.
Well, good God, yes. I mean, look, we're the planet that eats itself.
We really are.
Nature is ingestible. I hadn't thought about it in quite that way, but that's really true. Nature is ingestible because if you can't ingest it, you can't gain nourishment. You can't live. Nature is ingestible.
And it's regenerative.
Holy smokes.
And it's regenerative. And again, this flourishing of tea, there's a certain innate desire for its flourishing. And I think that when we take it upon ourselves to cultivate a relationship with tea, and we learn how to brew sheng, for instance, as I'm going back to, and people used to think of me as being a champion for sheng, and, oh, Brian never drinks shocha. I actually love shocha, and I produce shocha, and I feel like it's essential. It's part of that yin-yang dynamism that we referred to earlier, of one without the other. But when we learn how to brew sheng cha, it's basically practicing qigong. It's learning how to cultivate qi in the body.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about paoing a little shocha, pao shocha. 跟我们说怎么泡shocha.
So we're starting on with short shelf here.
How do you do it? Yeah. No. Sheng cha.
Or shung. Okay.
Sorry.
Wow.
Yeah. How do we pile up some sheng cha? How do we brew it up?
Well, I guess in a very brief and practical sense, we use porcelain rather than a clay teapot. And we want a large enough vessel to allow for the opening up of that compressed piece of tea in the vessel. We want to give it some elbow room in there. More often than not, we want to use boiling water. And I always tell people, err on the side of rinsing too long rather than too short. So in effect, what we're doing is we're taking something that has a very strong material structure, this strong compressed structure. I picture it as a flower bud. And through the application of heat and moisture and duration, we're allowing that bud to open up and to blossom and to express its color and its fragrance and its spirit. And so, again, I'm being metaphorical, I'm being poetic about it. I offered a little bit of technique, but then there's that engagement with the senses, that observing the unfurling of the leaf and entering into a certain time-space relationality with the tea itself, this mutuality between the tea and our own hearts, being clear and empty in ourselves to allow us to resonate or to experience that resonant quality of unfurling and opening up and releasing its spirit.
So pay attention to the tea.
Pay attention to the tea.
Pay attention to the tea.
Yeah.
Watch it. See how it interacts with the water.
All of that. I tell people, drinking tea, appreciating tea is the way that animals maneuver through nature tacitly and implicitly. They're not thinking about the color of a thing, but they're observing, and it's affecting the way in which they participate in that ecology. But with tea appreciation, we go from the eyes to the nose to the mouth to the throat before we can go into the interior. And the interesting thing about that is that these we can all talk about. You and I can sit at a tea table and brew tea, and as we're decanting the tea, we can be paying attention to the color and the viscosity of the liqueur to get a sense of the inspiritedness, right? The li liang, the potency and the strength and the spirit of that tea. And oftentimes people can smell the fragrance from where they're sitting rather than having to take the cup and bring it up to their nose. So paying attention first to the color, then to the smell, then to the flavor, and just being internally aware. And this actually brings me back to your observations about the difference between the Japanese tea room and the Taiwanese tea experiences that you've had. And a belief that I have, call it an insistence or simply an underlying truth of tea practice, that the principles that are being affected with precision in that space of the Japanese tea room, and this is cha dao practice or matcha practice, not sencha. Sencha in Japan is very similar to what you're experiencing in Taiwan, and there's a historical continuity between those. But what's happening in the interior space of the tea room in a very surgical and precise manner in Japan, I would say is happening tacitly in that tea room in Taiwan. It's an engagement with the five senses that's extremely explicit and constructed in Japan, but which is tacit. It's cultivated through appreciation of the liqueur, and it's discussed, but it's simply enjoyed in a social environment. It's the flourishing of the Tao in Chinese tea culture. So, I had this really interesting experience where I went back to China one year, having realized that tea conforms to this Chinese notion of sanjiao or sanjia he, the harmony or the unity of the three teachings or schools or families of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And that's when I really started to get this idea that tea really does convey the history of consciousness of the unfolding of the natural mind of the East in a really subtle and profound manner. And I presented this revelation to my mentor, to my shifu, and he said, "Yeah, tea's 3 things, but not those things." So, leave it to our teachers to call us out, right?
I love it. Yeah. 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 Tea is 3 things, not those things.
So I was like, well, what are they? Tea is 生活. Oh, no, first, 健康. Tea is health.
Jiankang Health.
生活, lifestyle, as you're describing, and 修行, cultivation. And I said, that's what I just friggin' said, man. No, that's what I said. It's the same thing. In my mind, it was the same thing. And he just kind of laughed. Man lai. I was like, oh, take it slow. Think about it. And like
that is one of my favorite phrases in Chinese. Man lai. I mean, you can use it in so many ways. Like, yeah, okay, like just take your time. Not yet, but hang in there. Keep going.
Forbearing, it's this, enduring the suffering, to go back to another thing where
enduring the suffering.
Enduring.
Yeah, I mean, we have to endure. We have to, let's say, enjoy some suffering. That's a Freudian slip.
And within tea, we say 先苦后甜, first bitter, then sweet.
Then sweet, yeah.
We don't want to just sit there constantly eating sweets, right? We need to be willing.
God, Brian, it's so true. It's so true. There it is, right there in a teacup. I was going to say nutshell, but there it is in the teacup. First bitter, then sweet.
Yeah.
Like so many worthwhile things in life. It can be hard in the beginning. Yeah, it's bitter. Yeah, I'll cool, right? You got to eat some bitter. But there's sweetness on the other side of it.
And so it's brilliant, isn't it, Michael? I mean, it's just so...
It is brilliant.
It's so incredible, So your description of, again, your experience of drinking tea in Taiwan, it's really interesting how as we follow the evolution of tea drinking practices out of its botanical and cultural origins, which is where I live and work and practice, out to the periphery, that it's also an historical narrative of 先苦后甜, of first bitter then sweet, that speaks in a more transcendental sense or an overarching sense to tea and the way in which it's participated in this project of humanity. And so we follow the evolution of tea drinking practices and of even social evolution out of the tea forests. And, from the time of Shandong, or 3,000, 2,000 years ago, and then through the Tang and the Song and Yuan and Ming and Qing to the present, and the way in which tea drinking practices informed the way tea was cultivated and crafted and appreciated and enjoyed in society. And it really presents us with something just so remarkable. And my sense of a lot of the tea that's being produced today, and there are poor practitioners and producers who also understand this to be true, that a lot of teas are being crafted in such a way as to push the sweetness and the fragrance out to the surface and eliminate as much as possible the bitterness and the astringency.
Well, then we lose the whole other side of that yin-yang.
Well, then we
lose the other side of that dialectic conversation. We lose the other side of the possibility of actually understanding sweet if you don't know bitter.
The transformative capacity of the whole. Absolutely.
Transformative capacity of the whole. Man, okay. That's probably a great place to put a pin in it for today. There's a lot more to talk about, but I've got to get to clinic here in a few minutes.
I think we managed to start to unpack tea in a different way than we did last time. And pour in particular wasn't so specific to the substance itself. It went there, but it really just opened up the potential, hopefully, to revisit the conversation and to maybe serve as a provocation for the listeners to think about tea a little bit more differently.
Yes, I like that. Man, now I want to grab my portable recording gear and come visit you and we'll drink some tea and have one of these conversations.
It's bound to happen one of these days, Michael.
Yeah. That'll be our part 2. That'd be great.
All right. Yeah, yeah, maybe in the Tea Mountains in Yunnan.
Okay.
So you might have a flight as part of that. So
可以
curry, 那很好啊。
可以 Uh-huh. Yeah. 太好了. That sounds great, actually. All right, Brian. Thank you so much. This has really been a delight.
Thank you again, Michael. Yeah, had a great time with you today.
I remember buying a scooter when I lived in Taiwan. There was a little scooter shop that I walked by on my way to study with Dr. Zhang. It was well run, part repair shop, part used scooter dealer. I'd seen the Laoban, the owner, and he'd seen me as I frequently walked by his place. As a foreigner, I stood out. So we were already a little familiar with each other when I decided that I needed a new set of wheels. The process of buying a scooter in Taiwan, it takes a full afternoon. It takes a full afternoon because you have to get to know each other a bit, like why I was walking by his shop a few times every week, like how business is, fixing scooters, something about politics and pretty girls and children, and what life is like in America, and how traffic rules in Taiwan, not the same as where I'm from. And all of that over tea. It's not enough to simply make a business transaction. You have to get to know something of the person that you're working with. It pays off too, because when I had a problem with the battery, he was right there to help. I had a trusted place for service, and beyond that, I had a delightful afternoon that also resulted in the purchase of a snazzy Kimco set of wheels. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.